First of all, thank you all for being here. On behalf of my colleague Chantal and I'd really want to thank you for your support of Stanford University. Thank you for coming to listen to hear what we say. And please don't be angry if anything we say happens to go against your own partisan view of the 2016 election. Now, I have to offer a disclaimer at the start of my talk, and that is that I actually work for one of the presidential candidates, and my appearance here is as a professor and not as a political consultant. That said, I enjoy telling people I serve at the pleasure of the next president of the United States. So with that as a preamble, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2016 election from the point of view of the type of work that I do and give you a window into what I think is the very steep hill that any Republican nominee, let alone Mr. Trump, has to climb in order to reach some level of competitiveness, and why I think that's unlikely. In case it wasn't clear, I don't actually work for Mr. Trump. So there are three sort of broad general theories of national election swing. One that I particularly dislike is the theory of electoral cycle. You'll hear this spouted a lot on the news. That's the idea that there's some historical precedent for which party wins the White House, and gee, it's very difficult for a party to win the White House 3 elections in a row, therefore we can predict what the outcome of this election is going to be. By and large, that is generalizing from a really small n. I don't think it's a very good model of electoral outcomes. A second model you hear a lot is the political economy model. You hear this a lot from some of my colleagues in political science who have a very political economy bent, and that is that elections are determined on the basis of economic fundamentals. What is the growth in gross domestic product in the second quarter of an election year? Or what does it mean if the unemployment rate is above a certain threshold? I think that those arguments are by and large correct, but they apply to a smaller and smaller segment of the electorate. Instead, I look at a third sort of model, and that's one I call the demographic model. Most voters in American public life hold relatively steady preferences. So elections are best understood not by which way people sway, but by the composition of the electorate on election day. By the way, this is what explains the midterm effect. We've had a lot of Democratic victories in presidential elections and a lot of Republican victories in midterm elections, and part of the reason we see that trading back and forth is that the electorate in a presidential year just doesn't look like the electorate in a midterm year. Different people are showing up to vote. Now, this endogenizes both enthusiasm and the population change. So who turns out to vote on election day depends in part on who's motivated, but it also depends on who's available to turn out. What does the American public look like? Now in 2016, the Democratic nominee, in 2012 rather, the Democratic nominee was an African American, albeit the incumbent president of the United States, but nevertheless, there's a well understood race penalty to be paid for in the United States by candidates of color. The unemployment rate was well over 7%, in some places approaching 8%. And the Republican Party won 59% of the white vote, comprising on election day 72% of the national electorate. Notwithstanding those facts, the Republican nominee lost by 5 million votes. So putting 2016 in that context, the Democratic nominee is likely to be a white woman. There's a gender penalty to be paid in American politics. Whether that penalty is larger or smaller than the race penalty, history will decide. The unemployment rate today is about 5%. The white share of the total vote is estimated to be down to about 70%. I've seen some political prognosticators, even from the right, suggest that the first digit might actually be a 6, that we might actually be in the 69.5% range. So with that in mind, what might we reasonably predict about the outcome of the 2016 election? This year, Latino voters are expected to surpass 13 million voters. If we go back to 1996, they were less than 5 million voters. In the last national election, Latinos were about 9% of the total electorate. Latino Decisions estimates that about 10.39% of the electorate in 2016 will be Latino. And there's some evidence for a fairly interesting electoral registration bump among Latinos. So Latino Decisions, which is the polling firm that I run on the side to send my kids to college, We did a threshold model for an organization called America's Voice, and we published this last summer. And in the threshold model, we essentially tried to estimate what it would take for the Republican Party to get to 50% plus one of the two-party popular vote if you make some simple assumptions about the size of each group in the electorate, the partisan distribution of their two-party vote. If we know or can make safe assumptions regarding the distribution of other groups, then we can solve algebraically for what the party needs to win from any particular one group in order to win for the presidency. Now, I should warn you, I'm not going to ask you to do any algebra today, so you're relieved from that. Don't worry about it. So thinking about this in the extreme, if Latinos were 100% of the voters, a candidate would need 50.1% of the Latino vote. And of course, if Latinos are 0% of the voters, the candidate doesn't need any of them to win. And so the truth is going to be somewhere in between. So in our threshold model, we estimated the Latino vote at 10.39% in 2016. We made a slight adjustment to African American vote, both in the share that went Democratic and in the share of turnout. There's a well-documented bump in the number of African American voters who came out to the polls with President Obama on the ticket. Reasonably, we might expect a little bit less enthusiasm now that we have the first national election without President Obama on the ticket in some time. If you hold white choices and Asian choices constant at 2012 levels, then you can solve for the share of the Latino vote that a Republican nominee needs in order to win 50% plus one of the national popular vote. And the answer to that is 47%. For some time, Karl Rove had been telling reporters and whatnot that Republicans needed 40%. And indeed, the last time a Republican won the popular vote in 2004, President George W. Bush got around 40% of the Latino vote. Interestingly, if you took the very same vote shares that George W. Bush got in 2004, and you brought that into 2016, if Mr. Trump did exactly as well as President Bush did among each electorate, he would still lose, because the composition of the electorate has changed so significantly since 2004. Now, if we did a second scenario, what if the Republican nominee outperforms Governor Romney and gets 60% of the white vote? Our estimate is that they would still need about 42% of the Latino vote to get to 50% plus one. So sort of thinking through this systematically, if the Republican nominee, Mr. Trump, does the same as Governor Romney, he needs 47% of Latinos. If he gets 60%, he needs 40 to 42%. It depends on your estimates about the other groups. If he gets to 62% of white voters, he needs to match Governor Romney's performance among Latinos. In the most recent poll that my polling firm ran for an advocacy organization, I was not involved for reasons of federal election law, the published result they came up with was an 11% support for Donald Trump. In order to do that, Mr. Trump needs to win 65% of the white vote in order to get to 50% plus one. And the last time any Republican did that was in 1984 when Ronald Reagan was running for re-election. So what are the results of the polling on this among Latinos? The first really comprehensive Latino poll, which are almost always from my firm, I'm happy to say, was run in the last 2 weeks of April, and so actually the first 2 weeks of April. So we polled April 3rd to 13th for America's Voice, which is an immigrant advocacy organization. We interviewed 2,200 Latino registered voters using landlines and cell phones and online, and we interviewed in English or Spanish at the subject's discretion at point of first contact. And again, I was not involved for reason of federal election law. Okay, now, the first thing to point out is, what do Latino voters think about? Well, when they're thinking about what's the most important thing that affects the Latino community, it is overwhelmingly immigration. 41% of our respondents listed immigration as one of the top 1 or 2 issues they are concerned about when thinking about what the government should be doing. When we ask what they think about the most important issues that the Congress or president should address for the entire country, Immigration falls to second place and the economy supplants it. But again, these two results are highly consistent, and education, again, is consistent in both polls. Prior to the immigration debates, the real serious immigration debates of the mid-2000s, for many years we used to say that the Latino agenda was the American agenda: education, jobs, healthcare, low crime. Nothing particularly specific about that. But the immigration debate has supplanted all others in the minds of how Latino voters think about elections. We asked the favorability and unfavorability of various national figures in this year's election. President Obama has a 73% favorable rating compared to 23% unfavorable. Secretary Clinton, 61% compared to a 32% unfavorable. Senator Sanders, 61-24. We'll skip the dearly departed and drop down to Mr. Trump, who had a 9% favorable rating and an 87% unfavorable rating. Now, everyone knows some of the things that Mr. Trump has said about building a wall and about the nature of Mexican immigrants, but I think it's important for this audience, most of you are not Latino, to understand how viscerally this feels when the words are expressed. So let me personalize that for you. When Donald Trump says that Mexico sends rapists and criminals, to the best of my knowledge, my grandfather didn't rape anybody. My father and his 4 brothers, one of whom lost his life near the 38th parallel, they didn't rape anybody either. Neither I, my brother, nor my 2 sons. That's what Latinos hear when they hear Donald Trump speak. Even among Latinos who identify as Republicans, 73% had an unfavorable view of Mr. Trump, and actually 56% had an unfavorable view of Senator Cruz. In a head-to-head matchup in that poll, Secretary Clinton outpolls Mr. Trump 76-11. Her margin over Senator Cruz was smaller, but still quite sizable. The remainder were undecided, declined to answer. Now, why does immigration matter? Apart from the very visceral reaction of some of the comments of Mr. Trump, immigration is a weight on the entire GOP among Latino voters because of things like this. So we asked about support for DACA. DACA's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. It's a policy that was handed down in June of 2012, and it says that people who are carried across the border as youth, who are therefore not legally responsible for the actions of their parents, even though they're undocumented, they are protected from deportation as long as they're law-abiding, and they're given temporary residency for a period of time. When we asked our respondents in a split sample whether or not they wanted, as the Democratic candidate said, to continue DACA, or as the Republicans candidate said, to end DACA, for those who got asked about the Democratic candidates, 74% said continuing DACA made them more likely to vote for the candidate. For those who were asked about the Republicans, a different half of the sample, but the numbers are very similar. 73% said ending DACA would make them less likely to vote for the Republican candidate. A similar set of questions were asked about DAPA, which is Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. This was the action that was taken in November of 2014, which is currently on hold because of an injunction from a South Texas federal court, which was left in place by the Fifth Circuit. The case is pending in front of the Supreme Court. Again, 74% of our respondents felt more favorably towards the Democratic candidate who wants to continue DAPA, and more hostile to a Republican candidate who wants to end DAPA. Now, why does immigration matter so much to Latino voters when Latino voters are by definition Americans? They are born, usually born, some cases naturalized, but they're all citizens of the United States. And they're not only citizens, but they're registered to vote. So these are people who are involved and tied into the community. Why is it that immigration is so important? Well, for starters, 57% of Latino registered voters know someone who's undocumented. When you ask them who that is, over half the time it is someone to whom they are related. Neither the Democratic nor the Republican parties have ever really gotten this right. They seem to believe, for reasons that escape me, that they could separate Latino politics from immigration politics and they can still appeal to Latino voters, notwithstanding their views of immigrants. That's clearly nonsensical. The connections between Latinos and the issue of immigration occur at the familial level. Individual families are of mixed status. You might be an American citizen, your brother-in-law might be naturalized, his wife might be undocumented. The idea that just because you're a citizen, you have no connection, personal or otherwise, to the immigration issue is silly. And more to the point, as I illustrated with my own personal take, 87% rather, of all Latinos, citizens of the United States, are within 2 generations of the immigration experience. If you're not foreign-born yourself, there is a virtual certainty that either one of your parents or one of your grandparents is foreign-born. So when you talk badly about immigrants, it's very, very personal. We asked people how interested they are in this election. 48%, a plurality, were more interested and more excited about voting in 2016 than they were about voting in 2012. And when we asked them why, voting against Donald Trump was the plurality answer. 41% are happy to go vote against the Donald. Okay, we've been asking this question since 2010 about the 2 political parties. And we say, with each political party, what best describes them? Would you say that they truly care about Latinos, that they don't care too much, or that they're actively hostile? So what you're seeing here is the Republican Party is in dark blue and the Democratic Party is in teal here. So the Democratic results, 53% of our respondents felt that Democrats truly cared about them. Another 20% said that Democrats don't care too much, and only 12% said that Democrats are hostile. I should tell you, this is an improvement. As recently as 2004, those numbers were down to 45. The inaction on immigration and the rather despicable deportation record of the presidency, the current president, has driven a number of Latinos into cynicism about the Democratic Party. But Mr. Trump is certainly helping in that recovery. By contrast, if you look at the Republican attitudes on Republicans, only 14% of Latino registered voters believe Republicans truly care. 42% say Republicans don't care, and 31% say Republicans are actively hostile. So what are the key findings from the study that we completed in April? The key findings we have are that the parties seem to be heading in the opposite direction on immigration, and not surprisingly, they're heading in the opposite direction on their ability to attract Latino voters. And part of that is because of ties between the Latino registered voter community and the actual issue of immigration. I mentioned that 57% of the voters that we surveyed here know someone is undocumented. We actually have as many as 1 out of 3 who knows someone who is a DACA applicant. 1 out of 3 knows someone who has been detained or subject to deportation. So I'm going to stop there. If you're interested in following the work that Latino Decisions does on the whole general question of race and politics and Latinos in the political system, you can follow us at latinodecisions.com, on Facebook, or on Twitter at Latino Decisions. And with that, I'll turn over the floor to my colleague Shanto Iyengar, who's going to walk you through a more detailed or academic aspect of how people think about what they're seeing.
Thanks, Gary. And thanks, Raul, for the kind introduction. And I've mentioned to Raul that I have to beg his indulgence because almost all my slides have come right out of Poli-Sci 120B, and he took Poli-Sci 120B last term. So after listening to, I hadn't had a chance to really see Gary's slides, so let me try and provide some kind of a segue. So Gary provided 3 models of predicting the 2016 election. I'm going to reassure you that my long-term memory is somewhat better than Governor Perry's, so I can remember all 3 of them. The electoral cycle model was this idea that you can only have one party in office for 2 consecutive terms, therefore Trump's got a good chance in 2016. And he also talked about the economic forecasting model, and finally, the changing demographics. And the data that Gary presented make those of us who can't bear the thought of a Trump presidency feel pretty good. So I'm going to warn you right off the top that I'm a bit more cynical about the American electorate, and I'm going to argue that there's a fourth model, which is a model that points to the effects of campaigns. And that, so it's possible for candidates to play the race card, and that in doing so, they might be able to attract a sufficient number of people who have some degree of racial prejudice, either against African Americans or against Latinos. And in that sense, I think Mr. Trump might, in the end, be a viable candidate. So I'm going to run you through a brief history of these coded racial appeals. I'll begin by making the point that Gary's already made, namely that the Republican Party is pretty much dependent on whites. And so they're going to have to do extremely well with the white vote. And in order to do that, that in and of itself, that is an incentive to sort of wave the race flag. And there's a long history. This is not something that Ted Cruz or Donald Trump invented. This has been going on for the last 30 years. And so I'll just walk you through that history. Crime as an implicit racial appeal in the 1980s. In the 1990s, again, those of you who live in California can probably remember the 1994 gubernatorial campaign quite well. Pete Wilson against Kathleen Brown. And for the first time, we had the issue of illegal immigration proving pivotal in that race. I'll say a little bit about the psychology of wedge appeals. How do they work? This theory of racial priming. And then finally, I'll close with some fairly pessimistic thoughts about what does the combination of partisan polarization, and by that I mean the scenario that we're playing out today, which is that Republicans and Democrats are really, they don't really get along, not just in the Congress and in the state houses, but also at the level of rank and file Democrats. So it turns out we've been doing a lot of survey work on partisan affect. How do people feel about their partisan opponents? And it turns out it's pretty high. And I'll show you some data. People, for instance, today, if you look at the level of inter-party marriage, well, you may all know about Mary Matalin and James Carville, and you may have noticed that she just changed her registration in the aftermath of the Trump victory. She's now registered as a libertarian. But it turns out that today, almost everyone, marriage is now a political statement. Over 90% of couples today have the same party affiliation. So you take that idea of partisan animus, and then you add what Gary was talking about, calling Mexicans rapists and all of that. Well, it's a fairly incendiary combination, and given what we know about American culture and the tradition of violence, it does not make me feel all that sanguine about this upcoming cycle. Okay, let me very quickly then just show you some numbers. So if you're talking about politics as a contest based on party, you can see that the Republicans have a problem. I mean, the Republicans are outnumbered by Democrats. Okay, there's a fairly substantial Democratic edge in the electorate. This is every single voter. This is the national voter file. So every single registered voter. This is not a survey. This is just population estimates. So if you go to the other side and then look at, what if the election were just based on ethnicity and race? Well, there you can see that there's very clear advantage. Whites still represent pretty much 3 out of 4 registered voters. And those thinner slices are the non-white population. So basically, you can see that Republicans would much prefer if, when people went to the polling place, their racial identity contributed somewhat to the end result, i.e. Their voting preference. Okay, so this is just another way of looking at it. If you look at all the registered Republicans out there, you can see they're pretty much dependent upon whites. Gary's made this point already. And I'll simply gloss over this. Clearly they have an incentive to make voters think about race rather than party politics or other kinds of issues. This is the Republican share of the white vote in recent elections. So if this country was all white, if this was a predominantly white electorate, you can see that the Republican Party would be doing just fine. Okay, so if I'm a Republican and I want to racialize the election, I want to make people think about the fact that they're white and that their white racial interests are in competition with the interests of Latinos or African Americans, how do I do it? Well, if I'm Donald Trump, I might say, I'm pro-white, vote for me. But that's unlikely to work, even in the case of Mr. Trump. So in the past, what Republicans have adopted, a more subtle approach, is to introduce issues that people associate with non-whites. And one of these issues is crime, racial stereotypes being what they are. White Americans tend to associate racial minorities with criminality. And so candidates who posture as tough on crime, in the jargon of political science, are making an implicit racial appeal. Simply because people associate crime with minorities. I'm tough on crime. I'm promoting white interests. And as I said earlier, there's a long history of this, going all the way back to Nixon's Southern strategy. Nixon, of course, was running for office at a time when the South was heavily Democratic. And so this kind of, the Southern strategy was an explicit attempt to peel off white Southerners from the Democratic Party and get them into voting for Nixon and the Republicans. But as the South realigned in the 70s and 80s, of course, there was a profound transformation in the political makeup of the South. It became a solidly Republican area. Then the nature of the campaign strategy changed, and the Republicans decided to sort of position themselves as the law and order candidate on a national basis. And just judging from the age distribution of you in this audience, many of you will probably remember the famous revolving door ad, which I'm going to show you, which of course helped Vice President Bush overcome a fairly substantial deficit in the polls at the time he was running against Governor Dukakis. And then, as I said earlier, we have the substitution of crime. Illegal immigration takes the place of crime as the wedge appeal of choice in the 1990s. And there is this landmark election in 1994 where the Wilson campaign is able to introduce, well, it was also Prop 187, they were able to introduce illegal immigration as the theme of their campaign. And just as Bush did in 1988, they were able to overcome a fairly substantial deficit in the polls by running exclusively on immigration and crime. Okay, so this is the revolving door ad.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
So that ad ran around mid-September. Dukakis was leading by about 10 percentage points. He never responded. And the conventional wisdom is that this ad was fairly critical in Bush's successful attempt to make up that deficit in the polls. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward 6 years now to 1994, and this is from the California governor's race. This is the Pete Wilson "They Keep Coming" ad.
They keep coming. 2 million illegal immigrants in California. The federal government won't stop them at the border, yet requires us to pay billions to take care of them. Governor Pete Wilson sent the National Guard to help the Border Patrol. But that's not all.
For Californians who work hard, pay taxes, and obey the laws, I'm suing to force the federal government to control the border. And I'm working to deny state services to illegal immigrants. Enough is enough.
Governor Pete Wilson.
And so 2016, we now have the sort of, the circle is complete. We have candidates now, Republicans, advertising both on immigration and crime. So this is a Cruz ad. I'm not singling out Cruz. It just happens to be an ad I found.
My son, Grant, was killed working an overnight shift at his job by an illegal immigrant. He was out on an ICE bond. He should have been deported. My son's death was completely preventable. I trust Ted Cruz. He believes in our Constitution. He believes in the rule of law. It's time we put somebody in office who puts the American people first.
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
Well, Donald Trump has run exactly the same ad. I'm not going to show it, so I'm just going to, in the interest of time, I'm
Donald Trump, and I approve this message.
I'm going to fast forward. So how do these appeals work, these coded racial appeals? Well, there's quite a bit of academic research on this question, and political scientists have coined the term a priming effect. So it turns out when people are repeatedly exposed to campaign appeals that have some sort of a subtext that is racial, it does activate people's racial attitudes. And so a political scientist at Princeton, Tolly Mendelberg, did the first study on the impact of the Horton ad, and she pretty much showed that exposure to that message activated people's racial attitudes. These racial attitudes became more important in predicting their political preferences. And a student I was teaching at UCLA at the time, Adam Simon, wrote his doctoral dissertation at UCLA on the 1994 immigration campaign in California, and he showed very convincingly that the people who were exposed to those immigration messages were much more likely to base their vote choice on racial considerations. So there's pretty good evidence that when candidates do this, they are actually changing the voting calculus of significant numbers of voters. So now, how might we anticipate, so what's going to happen in 2016? Assuming that Mr. Trump continues to run this campaign of basically race baiting, will it work? And I said earlier that I'm not, there's some chance it might. So here's some data from Pew in which people are asked about the state of their own life. And you notice that compared with 50 years ago, how would you describe your life outcomes today? And notice that whites are super pessimistic. They're much more pessimistic than blacks or Latinos. So that, to me, suggests that there's some potential here for Trump to score points with disaffected whites. A related question, what about how do Americans feel about the changing composition of the US electorate, the increasing diversity of America? Notice that among Republicans, it's a minority that believe diversity is good. So both these data points, the fact that people are disaffected, that whites are disaffected, and here they're not exactly cheering on the cause of diversity, suggests to me that implicit racial appeals might be effective in 2016. Now, I said I wanted to close with some thoughts about polarization. As I said, we've got quite a bit of data, survey data, documenting that Democrats and Republicans are increasingly displaying quite a bit of ill will towards each other. It begins approximately in the late 1980s, and party affiliation has now become a sort of a litmus test for interpersonal relations. People live in essentially segregated areas, segregated by partisanship. My block on Bryant Street in Palo Alto, I have the voter file, so I know everyone's voter registration. And it turns out, and he never comes to the block party, and I don't blame him, because there's only one Republican on my block. So you have this residential segregation, and as I said earlier, same-party marriages are now at 85%. And by the way, that's a very important point, this point about it's not just people are expressing ill will towards the opposition party, not because there isn't any penalty. Survey researchers have a big problem in terms of measuring attitudes towards race, because people can't be spontaneous. I mean, if I ask you, how do you feel about affirmative action, how do you feel about laws that maintain racial equality? Everyone feels some social pressure to give the egalitarian response. And so it's almost, the American National Election Studies is a face-to-face interview. So the interviewer is right in front of you asking you, I'm going to give you the scale. I'm going to ask you to rate a whole bunch of groups from 0 to 100. 0 means you really dislike them. 100 means you have a very warm, you really like them. African Americans, Muslims, atheists, Hindus. Well, it turns out most people give these groups ratings of between, 45 and 60. But then when they're asked, Democrats or Republicans, the Democrats and the Republicans, well, I'll show you the data right here. This is the distribution on this feeling thermometer. So you can see that the Democrats, almost all of the Democrats placed the Republicans between 0 and 15, and all of the Republicans placed the Democrats between 0 and 15. So there's a lot of hostility being expressed. This is a face-to-face survey question, whereas if I showed you the feeling thermometers on blacks and whites, you would see there was almost no difference. And a lot of that, as I was saying earlier, a lot of that is due to political correctness. It's almost as though when you say, okay, now I'm going to ask you about how do you feel about Republicans, there is this palpable sense of, oh, I can really say what I believe now. And so that's why you get this kind of, anyway, we suspected that that might be one of the big reasons why there's so much animus in the survey. So we actually did an implicit test. Some of you may have done the race IAT. If you haven't, I strongly recommend that you do so. I've taken it about 100 times. And you can't manage your score. It's a subconscious test. It measures implicit bias. And so we administered a replication of the race IAT. We swapped out the racial images for partisan images. And we found that implicit subconscious prejudice against the opposition party exceeded implicit prejudice against African Americans, among whites, that is. So that's a pretty powerful finding. It's telling us that it's not just that people are willing to say bad things about Republicans or Democrats. They genuinely believe it, even when they're not thinking, even at the level of their subconscious attitudes. Okay, I'll just wrap up very quickly I just wanted to show you, this is the finding on same-party marriage. So we've been tracking it all the way from 1965, when it was barely above 70%, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Republican spouses. But notice after 2000, it just takes off. And now you've got, pretty close to anyone who's married. The prediction is it's a homogeneous partisan environment. What's particularly important is that point on the side there. You could, after all, just accidentally end up marrying someone from the same party. It's not the case that you were actively seeking out a spouse based on their political views. Well, it turns out, we've looked into this in some detail, it turns out today the principal explanation for partisan intermarriage is indeed selection. So if you look at people who just got married and compare them with people who've been married for 40 years, so you might argue, well, if you just got married, there's potential for disagreement because you didn't really know much about your spouse's politics. Other factors were driving the selection. Well, it turns out that today, the partisan agreement rate among newlyweds is exactly the same as the agreement rate among people who've been married for 40 years, which suggests that indeed the selection model tends to be driving marriage. Okay, so in closing, I simply want to say that in the context of polarized parties, we should be pretty concerned that attempts to divide on the basis of race and ethnicity, particularly when the rhetoric is not so implicit, as Gary has pointed out, the personal consequences for Latinos of Trump referring to Mexicans as rapists. It seems to me that we really have a risk of, in this campaign, of very strong feelings being evoked by the candidates and aggressive behavior. And given, as I said earlier, given that this is America, I am worried about the possibility of violence on the campaign trail. And on that somewhat pessimistic note, I will open it up. I will open it up for your comments and questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask a question, there's microphones in either aisle and there's a microphone upstairs. In the interest of the recording, try to get to a mic to ask your question. And in about 15 minutes when we're done, you know there's a reception. For those of you who would like an alternative activity, those Democrats in the audience, we're going to go find the guy on Shanta's block and really let him have it. But it's probably best that you go to the reception. So.
Yes, please.
If something comes of the email server situation in terms of an indictment of Senator Clinton, could that have any significant effect on the election, do you feel?
If such a thing were to happen, I think that would have an effect. I suspect under such circumstances, if Secretary Clinton has received the nomination at that point, that she may in fact step back. My understanding of the situation is that there's not actually a criminal probe underway for Secretary Clinton, much to Fox News' profound disappointment. But we'll see. We'll see. Obviously, it would not be a good thing, as you can imagine.
Okay. What about on the intermarriage and so forth? The statistics, is that the same for young people? I just asked because it seems to me more the younger people are, the more they're. First of all, they intermarry more, and I'm just curious about allowing different opinions as far as parties.
Yeah, that's an important point, because as I was saying, you might marry and your politics may be quite different, but then over the course of your lifetime, there's some kind of adjustment. In the 1970s, the data that was collected, it turns out that the people who were on the younger end, unfortunately, that study, most of the spouses in that study were over the age of 50. So we didn't have too many really young people. But the longer you had been in a relationship, the longer the length of marriage, the greater the agreement, suggesting that over time, one spouse was persuading the other. But today, as I was saying, that is not the case. Newlyweds and people who've been married for 40 years have exactly the same level of homogeneity.
I bet we could, maybe there's already been done, I bet you could experimentally induce an increased assessment of the attractiveness of a potential mate if you inform the experimental subject that they're a copartisan.
No, but actually even better, the study that really needs to be done is a study of people who've just been divorced.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So I'm probably not the target demographic, but who watches commercials anymore? So my question is, do you have data on today's
Very good point.
viewers, and are they watching commercials at the same rates they were in these past elections?
It's not, you're absolutely right. Things have changed. People are not sitting down, turning on their television and watching, the ad breaks. Things are now digital. There's a lot of advertising on social media. There's a lot of recycling of controversial ads. So yes, the platform on which people consume ads is different, but the level of exposure is still pretty considerable.
Yes, sir.
If you look at presidential elections and you think about, it's not just one person, it's putting your team together. And, I'd love to hear who Secretary Clinton is considering as her vice presidential candidate. Because you look back on Jack Kennedy, when Jack selected, and I'll just say that I think Cory Booker would make a great vice president.
So two things. I share a high opinion of Senator Booker. So I don't function at that level, and even if I did, I couldn't tell you. But I don't function at that level. For whatever reason, Secretary Clinton doesn't call her Latino pollster to decide her vice president. There's people who are a little more, have better offices in Brooklyn. But Senator Booker does have a gigantic disadvantage, and that is that Senator Booker's governor is a Republican, Chris Christie. And if Senator Booker, or indeed any Democratic senator with a Republican governor, is placed on the ticket, that would mean that a Republican could appoint, at least temporarily, his or her replacement in the Senate, thereby diminishing the likelihood that the Democrats control the Senate. So Democratic senators from states with Republican governors have a higher hill to climb for selection as VP, notwithstanding their individual merit and importance and political acumen.
So, two-part question. The first is, to the extent that Trump modifies his messaging, are the numbers that you showed for Latino attitudes and support, do they have the possibility of evolving? And then secondly, in the first analysis, we saw kind of a 60% threshold for the white vote for Trump to win, that he's got to more than exceed that. Given the earlier analysis on messaging and coded messages targeted to the white population or white segment, how realistic is it for Trump to achieve that if he doubles down on that approach?
I'll take the first half, and the first half. Recovery of reputation is more difficult today than it was, say, 20 years ago. In the era of videotape and social media, everything you say lives on forever, which is why we have to be very careful on film here. And so you can imagine Trump might have said the rapist comment in July of last year when he announced for the presidency, but it will live on, I assure you. And nothing gets old under those circumstances. I would expect those numbers to creep up, if only because the undecideds disappear, and you would proportionally increase the 7611 to something that adds up to 100, so those numbers will go up. But I think that the attitudinal view of Mr. Trump among most Latino voters is very unlikely to change over the next 6 months.
Yeah, and given what we might expect in terms of campaign communication, banging of the drum of illegal immigration in particular, I would guess that the numbers that Gary showed, the negatives directed at Trump among Latinos are going to go up. So Trump's only prospect is what he keeps claiming, although I haven't really seen any good data on this, is that he can mobilize groups of voters, white voters, who previously did not vote. That's his only hope, that he can bring large numbers of whites to the polls, very much like the effect that President Obama had with African Americans in 2008. So maybe we're going to get just the inverse of that.
Gary,
Yes, yeah.
your expertise in Latin America or the Latino vote is interesting here. You point out the importance of the influence of that vote, and yet we also understand Latinos generally have a very low relative voting proportion to their population. Would you suggest that the wall issue is going to ignite any considerable improvement in the voting of the Latino?
Sure. Our estimate is, if you just simply fitted a linear line to suggest that the Latino vote will grow this year just simply based on population growth, you're going to climb up to close to 13 million anyway. But as you point out, that 13 million could have been higher. So in 2014, for example, only about half of the Latinos who could have voted did, and so they left like 11 million votes on the table. Really, huge problem. The question is, will they overperform relative to their history? There are two obstacles to that. One is Latinos are overwhelmingly a young population, and young voters historically don't vote. The median age of whites in this country is 43. The median age of Latinos is 27. So probably a third or more of Latino registered voters are in that category of people who don't turn out very much, notwithstanding race and ethnicity. So that's a problem. The second problem is that neither party calls them. So if you look at the American National Election Study, at the rates of contact, the difference between whites and African Americans on the one hand and Latinos and Asian Americans on the other is 10 to 15 points in self-reported contact by a party or a candidate. There's the old line from a Tip O'Neill story that's in the original Chris Matthews book Hardball about, why didn't you vote for me? And she said, because you didn't ask me to. Well, no one asks Latinos to vote of either party.
Gary, do you have any data on registration of new Latino voters? Because I'm hearing peripherally that there's a huge wave of new voters coming because of Trump's comments. And then for you, Shanto, if you can explain why even angry, maybe racist white voters are not understanding that Trump is just about Trump. What is it about him that's not translating to his supporters, I guess? Thank you.
I'm going to disappoint you on the question to me, which is that I've heard the same press reports that you have of Anecdotal accounts that registration rates of new Latino registrants are significantly higher than they were 4 years ago, which would be the relevant comparison. I'm not looking at the data file on a daily basis, so I'm not in a position to answer that. You could, I haven't, so I can't really answer it.
Well, and as far as Trump's image goes, what he's got going for him is that he's an outsider. There is this sort of wave of cynicism that is now probably 2/3 to 70% of the electorate is fed up with politics as usual. And so they're willing to cut him some slack on, these crazy comments he makes. Whether or not, in the general election, a sufficient number of them will decide that he's disqualified, I don't know. I certainly hope a sufficient number of them decide, but at this point, I just would have to say I can't say.
Yes, sir.
In all seriousness, we like to think that public education, that its main purpose, its goal is to educate future citizens to be critical thinkers, to protect our democracy's future. What does this support for Trump say about our public educational system?
I'll let Shanto take that one.
Well, I have to tell you that it's not so much the public educational system. I think more, if you're going to allocate blame, I would say it's more on the media. News coverage is now off compared to 20 years ago. There's just sound bites. The news has become, it's all about sex, sleaze, and scandal. There's not much substance. So yeah, it's a big problem that people don't really have the opportunity to learn about the issues, to deliberate. And so I can cite any number of statistics showing that there's a just tremendous level of misinformation out there.
Though there is some evidence from the primaries to suggest that a fair number of Trump voters are college-educated white males. So it's not just simply a lack of education. Some people are making that choice. Before we go up from the cheap seats.
I have a sort of a two-part question. First of all, what is the percentage of white registrants by party? Republican, Democrat, decline to state. And how much of each of those groups does Trump has to win the election?
I don't actually have those numbers at the tip of my. I don't actually have that committed to memory.
Come on,
Republican identification.
you're a Stanford professor. Come on, reel this out.
So I'll just make up an answer, and the $23 billion endowment will assure you that it's correct. Republicans are about 34% of the registered electorate. He needs to essentially win all of them in order to even be close to competitive. That 34% is probably 0.8 or more are white non-Hispanics, and only about 20% are comprised of racial and ethnic minorities. So if we look at white two-party vote over the last 6 cycles or so, whites comprise about 88 to 90% of the votes the GOP receives. And they're casting between 58 and 60% of their votes for Republican candidates. In all other racial and ethnic groups, those numbers are smaller.
Yeah, I don't have the exact, the one thing that one can say is that if you look at Democrats and their ability to get the white vote, the last Democratic candidate to get close to, I think he only got maybe 48% of the white vote, was Jimmy Carter. From that point on, the white vote has been disproportionately Republican.
So I'm curious about the racial priming effect. When you talked about that, is that consistent across all racial and ethnic communities, or does that vary depending on what group we're talking about?
Well, you have to be very careful in assessing the evidence from most of the work on racial priming is experimental work. So it's very, it's not large-scale samples. It's not thousands of people. We're talking about a typical study which might have 250 people. So it's very difficult to extrapolate from that and sort of make broad claims about different subgroups that might be more or less susceptible. One thing we can say for sure is that the degree to which you subscribe to these kinds of old-fashioned stereotypes about minorities, that is a key, what we call moderating variable, that makes you much more susceptible to that kind of appeal. So to the extent that we have pockets of America in which old-fashioned racial prejudice is alive and well, this kind of appeal is certainly going to be quite effective.
Yes, sir.
I'm coming back to a general thinking which may be exposed, maybe popularized the idea, and that is the 1% is being controlled. The government is controlled by 1%, or the rich people only, and the middle class is reducing. To what extent? This is the reason basically why the non-establishment candidates like Trump and Sanders. Sanders is almost a non-establishment candidate. So such people have been popular. So to what extent this will affect the election? You talk about ethnicity, and that's still there. But there is a more general idea of the 1% controlling the government. To what extent will that be effective to support Trump?
Well, I'll take a crack at that, Gary. I think that's playing out on the Democratic side right now. The Sanders campaign, inequality, and the skewed distribution of wealth, that's very much what's driving the Bernie campaign. And there's some questions being raised about the extent to which he's willing in the end to bury the, to come out and endorse Secretary Clinton, or whether he's going to sort of extract some real ideological concessions from her. So yes, I think that cleavage is playing out quite vividly on the Democratic side today. Not so much on the Republican side. I don't think inequality is something that Republicans really are thinking about at all.
Yes, ma'am?
I have two questions. One is, we've had a dismal turnout in terms of voting in the state of California. And I'm just curious, are you hopeful like I am that the fact that we could actually have some impact on this primary will get people rushing out to the polls? Question number one. And my second question is there like an ignorancy index? These individuals, the individuals who are supporting Trump with all the things he announces that he cannot do, never mind, getting appointed or anything, becoming the nominee. Does anybody ever indicate that it doesn't matter to them that he can't do these things, or they just want to, or they're just that ignorant is that way?
I'll take the first one, and I think that I can't speak to what turnout in the California primary is going to be overall. There is a competitive Senate race here, so there could be some enthusiasm. The California primary is very unlikely to have any impact on either party's nomination process. So if turnout is driven primarily by primary election processes, that's going to be difficult to be a justification for California turnout. And California suffers by the fact that its primary is so late in the process. And why America's largest state appears to choose to vote last is anybody's guess, but it's not in their interest.
Yeah, and as far as the question about the gold medal, there's a lot of data, cross-national comparative data, and there's no doubt about it. Americans are much less informed about public affairs than almost anyone living anywhere else. Just to give you an example, about 4 years ago, we did this 12-country comparative study, and one of the questions was to identify a separatist movement in Sri Lanka, which there'd been an ongoing civil war, and we asked people to, multiple choice question, the Tamil Tigers, and there's 5 options, and so you could say just by guessing, you should get it 20% of the time. But the modal response in this country was that it was an extinct species of tiger.
I can't top that. So.
Okay, so I think.
So we have time for one more question. Before that question, I'd like to remind you all that the reception is happening at the main quad immediately following this talk. You can feel free to walk. There's also 2 shuttles that are currently looping between the Gunn Cypher building, the intersection of Lasoyan and Sarah, and the main quad. And then from 7 to 9:45, those shuttles will run from the top of the Oval to the Galvez lot and Maples Pavilion. Thanks.
So Shanta, who gets the last question? One of these two guys?
Well, I think we've got time for two.
Two more. Okay, sorry, sir, but your side got this. Two more questions. We'll start with the cheap seats first.
Yeah, I'm interested in the role that you think non-Mexican Latino groups will have in this election, especially Cubans who are more conservative-leaning in swing states like Florida. How do they feel about Trump's statements, and how big of an issue is immigration to them?
So that's a very good question. Cubans are more conservative. It turns out there's a recent poll by Florida International University showing that Secretary Clinton is doing well, if not actually beating Mr. Trump among Cubans, who have declined to be only about 30% of Florida's Latino electorate. So that would be very, very bad news for Republican electoral strategists, because Florida is key to their map. Puerto Ricans, very, very Democratic supportive, and interestingly enough, even though they're US citizens, very, very pro-comprehensive immigration reform. And I actually had a woman tell me at a focus group, a Puerto Rican woman tell me, I'm not even Mexican, but if that man gets elected, I'm going back to Mexico.
Okay, so you get the last question.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask you if 2016 was an anomaly, or whether we should expect to see civility in political discourse continue to go downhill in the future.
Well, look, every single prediction that I've made between December and today about Mr. Trump has proven to be totally inaccurate. So I would say it is certainly an anomalous cycle. We've never ever seen a candidate like this before. And whether it'll ever, there's a term that we like to use in social science, perhaps this is the ultimate counterfactual, that this is something that indeed may never happen again.
I would answer by retreating to the point that I made in my slideshow, which is about the importance of demographics. Someone asked a question about the 1%, whether you're talking about the power elite, who leads either political party or whatever. Heterosexual white men now comprise about 26% of the national population, but they control the vast majority of Fortune 500 board seats, law firms, indeed every high-paying job in the country and most of the country's wealth. Power does not generally give itself up voluntarily. To the extent that the demographic changes in this country and the power distributions that are associated with it continue, I would expect politics to be pretty darn nasty for the foreseeable future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you.